Hello, my name is Artur Korotin, and welcome to my presentation on Counterpoint in Faure's String Quartet. What we are hearing is the recapitulation in the first movement of Faure's String Quartet, Opus 121. Faure began the work in 1923, keeping its whereabouts in secret. Finishing the quartet a year later in 1924, Faure refused to have the work published or performed until his colleagues deemed it worthy. It is the final work that he completed. So it is interesting to ponder, what is it that makes Faure sound like Faure in his mature style? That is why, as opposed to harmony and sonata form structure, we will look at counterpoint and how Faure gives life to his counterpoint through his orchestration. It is important to note that Faure is indeed invested in the Romantic classical sonata form. The movement features two trimodular blocks, one for the exposition and the other for the recapitulation. The development is a series of sequences a la classical era sonata, like Mozart or Beethoven, first in fourths, then in thirds. The movement abides very strictly to the formal plan. There is not a misplaced phrase in this movement. Dare I say, there might not be an extra note either. However, no matter how much you look at this big plan, it speaks nothing of the intricacies found moment to moment that make this piece unique. While listening to the exposition, take notice of these elements. When Faure does or doesn't leap in any voice, when Faure uses the lower range of the cello, and how Faure marks each new section in the form. What is interesting to note is that from the beginning, the trimodular block actually appears in the counterpoint. The viola outlines E, G, B. If you look from the third bar, starting from the viola, moving to the cello, and then the violins, you can even see that Faure has spelled a retrograde of this trimodular block. Formally, Faure imposes the trimodular block not only on the first five bars and the exposition, but on the first theme group as well, the first 16 bars. The exposition heavily emphasizes a dual treatment of the trimodular block. One as an organizational strategy for harmony and setting musical ideas, and another setting it as a melody, a concrete character that speaks and mingles with the other themes. These might seem like disparate concepts, but really, one is just a smaller or bigger version of the other. Each smaller version is contained within a bigger version, like a fish swallowed by a bigger fish, swallowed by a shark, swallowed by a whale. Let's go somewhere else. Somewhere nicer. Did you notice how Faure saved the C string of the cello until the very end of the transition to the second theme group? Additionally, Faure saves the first 5-to-1 motion in the bass as a pickup to this new section. Let's take a moment to appreciate the difference when Faure is only using stepwise motion to form a cadential gesture, as opposed to when he actually sets up a 5-to-1 imperfect authentic cadence. You know, there's something very simple sounding about 34 leading into 35, almost sublimely peaceful, serene, even. It's not the strong gesture that we often hear in classical era music. How is it that Faure achieves this more placid sort of sound? If we dig a little deeper, we see the upper three voices actually leap upwards in parallel motion, all in perfect intervals. That is very interesting. Parallel motion reduces a sense of contrast between the voices. If used tactlessly, it can disguise what actually should be brought out. Additionally, if we reduce all motion to only half notes, the second and first violins appear to be holding common tones with the downbeat of 35, while the cello and the viola move in parallel motion downwards. But it gets more curious. If you look at the second violin part in the first half of 34, and then the viola part in the second half of 34, you see that they are trading the same pitch, C4. The viola's G is taken up by the second violin an octave higher. So this is actually a voice exchange taking place. However, this voice exchange gives the illusion of a voice crossing. It creates a parallel octave. If you take the first violin line, leaping from D to D, then the third voice leaps from G to G, with the C natural voice being a static motion that is also being crossed over by the two Gs. It could be this very fine intermixing of voices that creates this calmer kind of 5-1 cadence. However, here's a completely different take. I sought to recompose this passage to sound more classical. However, instead, I discovered something very interesting and ended up having to compose nothing at all. Starting at bar 33 and ending with the downbeat of 35, the most simplified version on the top left is actually completely by the books. There are no voice crossings, there are no weird leaps, and the motions and the voices are interspersed instead of having similar motions and multiple voices stacked on top of each other. As we add the dotted figures in the eighth notes, going from the example from the top left to the top right, we see that these rhythms are only there as neighbor tones, or passing tones. But what Faure does in bar 34 is he transposes some of these figures up an octave to create an illusion of motion where otherwise there would have been harmonically static motion. Let's listen to a MIDI recreation of each of these three examples, starting from the top left to the top right, then to the bottom. Then we will hear the quartet perform this passage once more. So, which of my two explanations do you find most convincing? That is a question only you can answer for yourself. And that is probably the beauty of this quartet. There are many things one could look at from many different perspectives, but you can only decide for yourself what is the best solution despite there being multiple answers. Did you know Faure uses 4 unique types of cadences in this exposition alone? Let's take a look at the final cadence and the exposition, which is actually a plagal cadence and is much more straightforward than our seemingly classical 5-1 imperfect authentic cadence. Let's start by listening to this passage. So, to clear something up, despite how it appears in the score, the cello and the second violin together create 2 of the 4 voices in this texture. The second violin fills in the G when the cello goes down to its low E in bar 57. Otherwise, the cello would have to play a tenth in a rather low register, and that would be very taxing. However, on the downbeat of 59, the score shows the second violin playing a unison B with the first violin. That, too, is for a negotiating with the instruments and orchestrating these chords amongst them, as the F sharp the cello plays is outside of the violin's range. So as you can see, I reorganized this passage on a grand staff, grouping the voices to the likeness of their roles. The cello and the second violin and the bass staff are harmonic, while the viola and the first violin and the treble staff are melodic and are meant to imitate each other. Now, it is more clearly obvious that the first violin and the viola are again handing off this dotted figure, creating rhythmic motion and giving us that sense of polyphony and imitation that Faure used in the previous passage. What seems to be new here is how the viola voice in bar 56 seems to be connecting with the violin voice in bar 57, almost as though the viola is providing a pickup for the violin, and yet the viola actually leaps downwards in bar 57. Is this supposed to imitate a separate voice? Or are we meant to hear both instruments leaping downward? For the fun of it, I wondered perhaps this is another voice exchange with registral alterations. And, in fact, you do obtain smooth lines when you treat it that way. Just look at the last graphic. However, are we really meant to hear this relationship when we listen to this quartet? Do you really hear this type of intermingling between the lines when we listen to this moment? You be the judge of that. There is so much more to say, and yet, this is all the time we have. Thank you very much for hearing me talk about the Faure String Quartet and its many mysteries. There are certain details that were not discussed in this presentation that were addressed in the handout, and vice versa. Certain things were treated very differently between the two. So if you are interested, I advise you skim through that handout more closely. Have a good break. It was great being in class with you. This has been Artur Karotin with your way overdue Midnight Talks.